All right. Hi, everyone. We're just going to wait another minute or two while participants are logging in, just giving people a chance to access the webinar. And we did just put this up on Facebook, so it's live streaming. If for any reason you or perhaps friends in your network are having difficulty directly accessing the webinar, this is now live streamed on Facebook, so you should be able to watch it there as well. I should say that we had nearly 100 people sign up to attend this forum tonight, and so hopefully the reach will be even broader via social media, but I do want to give it another minute or two just to let some of those people sign on, and then hopefully throughout they'll also sign into the webinar too. Andrea, I just do want to tell you from a tech support perspective that I may receive emails at certain points directly asking for help with the link. And so what I'm going to do is forward that to your NYGB address. And if you could just keep an eye on that and help people out that are having trouble accessing, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Definitely. I've actually already answered a few emails, so feel free to send any more so I can help folks out.
Wonderful. All right, why don't we get started? And then hopefully more people will file in as we begin the conversation. So hi, everyone. Good evening and welcome. My name is Rebecca Fisher. I'm the Executive Director of New Yorkers Against Gun Violence. I'm sure some of you I've met you directly and are familiar with the organization. I hope some of you are new, and I'm glad to have you be here with us tonight. This program is part of our statewide education initiative called Connecting Communities to Prevent Gun Violence. We've been bringing together community leaders in New York, survivors of gun violence, elected officials at all levels of government, policy and public health experts, healthcare professionals, and others to discuss gun violence and the solutions that are saving lives. Throughout 2021, we held numerous statewide events and regional forums virtually with your support, and we're really looking forward to doing more of this during 2022. New York's state and local gun safety laws are some of the strongest common sense gun safety laws in the country. And yet gun violence is a growing public health crisis, even in our state as it is across the nation. The COVID-19 pandemic led to a rise in gun sales and illegal gun trafficking across state lines from weak gun law states. The pandemic also led to a surge in unemployment and poverty and deepened other systemic inequities in the poorest sections of New York cities, from housing to education to healthcare. These factors combined with easy access to guns has led to a big spike in gun violence in our state cities in particular, and has disproportionately impacted Black and Brown New Yorkers. According to New York State's Division of Criminal Justice Services, the number of New Yorkers who've been killed or injured by gun violence just towards the end of 2021 has nearly doubled since 2019. So as we move into a new phase of the pandemic, hopefully emerging out of the pandemic, although I'm hesitant to say that at this point, and we're now grappling with a violent and devastating war overseas, we continue to struggle with daily violence that's traumatizing our own communities and our own neighbors here in New York. Lawmakers, community leaders, policymakers, and others have new proposals and plans to address gun violence and to stop the shootings. For example, the New York City Mayor, Eric Adams, released his blueprint to end gun violence. Our governor, Kathy Hochul, has launched an interstate trafficking task force and started a new office to prevent gun violence. And just last night in Washington, President Biden asserted his own plans and commitments to end gun violence in his State of the Union address. Over the past few months, I've heard from many New Yorkers, and we have questions. We are looking for more specificity, and we have concerns and want more details. How do we address violence and public safety now while also ensuring justice and equity for all communities and survivors of gun violence? Which solutions are actually effective, and which proposals should we be concerned about? So hopefully we will be discussing these questions and many more tonight. And I'm extremely grateful that we are joined tonight by experts and leaders who are at the forefront of the fields of public safety and criminal justice reform. All are working hard on solutions to address the rising rates of gun violence. It's a privilege to have Brooklyn District Attorney Eric Gonzalez here tonight, who was recently profiled in the New York Times as a model for progressive prosecution. Thank you for being here. We're also joined by Professor Cami Chavis, a criminal law professor at Wake Forest Law University and the director of Wake Forest Law's Criminal Justice Program. I'm also thrilled to be joined by two of our policy and advocacy partners, Alice Hamblett and Ari Davis. Alice is with Common Justice and Ari is with the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence. New Yorkers Against Gun Violence has been working in coalition with both of these partners on our top two state legislative priorities. And I'm excited that Alice and Ari will be explaining each of these policies in more depth tonight. So thank you again for being here. I do want to just say before we continue with the questioning and begin sort of our interview and discussion, that if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. If they're not answered right away, we will address them later on in the conversation or at the end. And please try to limit it to just a few questions, maybe 3 max if possible, to give everyone the space to discuss. So DA Gonzalez, thank you again for being here. I would love to start with a conversation with you. I know that the Brooklyn community is near and dear to your heart as someone who's born and raised in Brooklyn, and you've been a prosecutor for your entire legal career. Can you just tell us a little bit about your own background, your professional background, and what led you to become a prosecutor in Brooklyn? Oh, you're on mute.
Let me start off by saying thank you, Rebecca, for the invitation to participate today, and to my fellow panelists. Thank you for taking the time out of your evening to do this with us. Like you said, I love Brooklyn. I've been here my entire life. I grew up in arguably the toughest neighborhood in New York City in the 80s and 90s. I was living in East New York in Brooklyn when it was called the murder capital of New York City. And unfortunately, growing up there as a teenager, I was exposed to rampant violence, gun violence, and crime. And it was something that at that time in my life, I was just hoping to survive through. I have many friends, and as some of you know, family members who have been victims of gun violence. And, it was, something that really caused me to think about how I could work and make my community safer. I did not know about assistant district attorneys or prosecutors directly, but I started to learn about this incredible power that prosecutors had to try to keep their community safe, but also knowing so many people at that age that were criminally justice involved, the power that they had to give people meaningful second chances. And so I read and learned as much as I could know about it. First in my family to graduate from high school, I went on to college and then to law school, and I wrote my admissions essay on what I could do if I was an assistant district attorney, because I realized that someone was going to make decisions that impacted my community. And I thought that someone who came from the community, who was close to understanding the problems of the community, was best situated to help make decisions. And so I was fortunate enough to be offered a job here in Brooklyn as an assistant district attorney. And I've done every job in this office. I started at the very bottom, and I handled summonses and violations and traffic issues, all the way to homicides over the years, and supervised. And when Ken Thompson was elected district attorney in 2014, he asked me to be his chief assistant. And after his tragic passing, I ran for district attorney, and I'm very grateful that the people of Brooklyn gave me an opportunity to serve. So since 2017, I've been the elected district attorney of Brooklyn.
Well, I very much appreciate that, in part because I had just stepped into my position as executive director right around the time that you were elected as Brooklyn District Attorney. And one of the first invitations that I received from your office was to be part of your transition and this Justice 2020 initiative that you launched as a part of your transition to elected office, which really had an impact just on me professionally in terms of engaging with other stakeholders in the community. So I would love for you to share a little bit more about what that initiative's intent was at the time, and how that has kind of played out over the last few years, particularly with the unanticipated global pandemic that hit Brooklyn and the rest of the country.
Yeah. Thank you. And first of all, thank you for participating in Justice 2020. My experience as a prosecutor at that time had really formed really strong opinions that simply arresting and prosecuting cases would not lead us to lasting safety. And if we could bring together really forward-looking leaders and thinkers on criminal justice issues, could we create something better in Brooklyn that would serve, really the two things that I think a DA must be concerned about: public safety and having an equitable and fair justice system. And I was very blessed that over 70 people offered to sit and think and come up with recommendations. Ultimately, every group worked on different recommendations. One of the things that Rebecca's group worked on was how do we deal with gun violence and what happens after a mass takedown of a gang or a crew that's doing shootings. How do we prevent the next young person from picking up that gun? And so we had 17 recommendations that came out of Justice 2020. And I just remind people that this work started a long time ago. Many of the recommendations then were really, truly groundbreaking. So I was the first district attorney that stopped prosecuting marijuana locally in New York City. That was one of the recommendations. There were a number of recommendations that came out, but ultimately I think, four major components of Justice 2020, which is let's use jail and convictions as a last resort as possible. Let's focus our efforts on identifying and incapacitating drivers of crime, the people who are really causing a lot of the dangerous harm, the shooters in our community. Let's engage stakeholders and communities as true partners in public safety. Let's give them more authority, and let's actually cede some power to the community to help shape our criminal legal system. And then finally, a commitment to transparency from my office about what's happening with our cases. The goal here was to create more fairness, but really make sure that we were doing a better job serving our communities. And part of being progressive, I thought, was also having a commitment to doing more for underserved communities. When in my years as an assistant district attorney, I knew when there was a shooting or some tragic event in Brooklyn Heights or Park Slope, it was likely to be solved. But the same was not true for my home in East New York or in Brownsville or Bed-Stuy. And so, demanding from the criminal legal system that every community be treated fairly and given the same amount of resources to help solve crime. And ultimately, much of the work that's come out of this office over the last 5 years is directly related to the recommendations that we came out of Justice 2020, including the work that we've done on guns. And I want to be real clear, because I think this is such an important moment. In 2018, Brooklyn had the fewest homicides in its history. In 2019, right before the COVID pandemic hit us, we had the fewest number of shootings in the history of Brooklyn. The strategies that we were deploying were working, they were reducing crime, and then 2021 happened, the numbers doubled. And so it wasn't almost double, the number of shootings did double in this county. It went from 290 shootings to over 650. So it was a dramatic rise, numbers I had never seen before. 98 shootings in 1 month alone over the summer. But I didn't give up, and we stayed with our strategy. And fortunately, last year, at the end of last year, homicides were down about 15%. Shootings, victims were down by about 22%. And as we're in the third month of this year, our numbers are down even from last year. So we're making some progress, but we have a lot more to do.
Well, I appreciate, the candor about kind of where we were and what we're dealing with now. And I think, it's something that we talk about frequently internally and also with folks who are working on this issue every day. But I think the general public, there's still this big question of why. What caused there to be such a surge? And a lot of people are kind of looking for there to be one variable in particular, because obviously if there was one variable that was causing the gun violence surge, then there would potentially be one solution to address that one variable. And I started to kind of list off some of the factors that we certainly have been explaining and sharing information about in terms of the public health research supporting the proposition that all of these different systemic inequities were just made so much worse by the pandemic. But I think it would be helpful to hear from you, what you think the primary causes of the gun violence surge have been over the past 2 years.
Yeah, well, I can tell you that I do not believe that there's one single cause for the increase in gun violence. The rise in gun violence, there was a lot of things that were happening at once. And because I don't believe there's one single cause, I think, we have to have a multi-pronged strategy to reducing gun violence and getting back to a safer Brooklyn, a safer New York City. But we can't underestimate that we lived through a once-in-a-century pandemic that caused, tremendous harm and trauma to communities, that played out in low resource communities in more dramatic ways. The number of fatalities caused by COVID in communities of color and poor communities, it was tremendously different than in other communities. The amount of displacement that took place in those communities in terms of loss of jobs, people who, obviously have office jobs or continuing to be able to work from home and do other things. The amount of turmoil that the pandemic caused in these communities where we saw gun violence really increase was dramatic. And so, there was a loss of jobs, and schools were closed and churches were closed, and a lot of the normalcy of our lives had been disrupted. But there was other factors as well. a lot of the preventative measures that actually keep gun violence, and it's not just simply law enforcement. There's a lot of effort made to prevent gun violence from happening. All of those things were not happening as well. So the things that we would do, working with other law enforcement partners, call-ins to talk to people who were engaging in acts of violence, to make sure that we would try to prevent that. Our ability to have our violence interrupters and our cure violence people who were trying to stem some of the violence before it ticked off, they couldn't do their jobs. Clearance rates from the police department in responding to acts of violence and shootings dropped to record lows, because for the first time, suspects were wearing masks and latex gloves, and so there were no identifications made. And so as the system failed our community, people took violence in their own hands, and there was a lot of retribution and retaliation, and that's a big factor. And we also have to remember that during that same period of time, there was a lot of turmoil in terms of social justice, and calls for reimagining policing, and there was the chokehold legislation, and there was a big concern from the police department that they were going to take a step back in some of the enforcement because they were uncertain about their role. And I think when you put all of that together, when you take away all of the preventative measures, and I haven't even gone through them all, but the things that we do in debriefing people to know where guns are and to do other things, when all of that stopped, we saw the consequence of it. But I do believe that if I had to choose one factor, I would say that COVID disrupted our lives, and it did so in such a dramatic and dangerous way that we saw people arm themselves. They no longer had confidence in the police or our society to keep them safe. And we saw that not just in communities of color in these low resource neighborhoods. I saw studies where, gun ownership increased legal gun ownership increased 64% across America, right? This was an area where people sort of started to believe that they would need to arm themselves and protect themselves. And the final piece that I'll say is, when we're working with people who get arrested for gun possession, the number one reason that's given to us that why they're carrying guns illegally is because they're afraid. They're afraid of being hurt or killed themselves. And so those systems, that trust, that social contract that we've had previously had fallen apart. And we're working very hard today to create that sense that people feel that they don't need to be armed to be safe walking down the streets today.
I certainly appreciate that kind of final sentiment in particular, because I think that there is a lot of misconception from the public that communities where gun violence is disproportionately impacting folks are carrying guns because they intend to commit crimes. And there's a criminalization stigma that comes along with that. When in reality, we do live in a country where there are people in all communities that strongly believe that guns protect them. Now, as a policy expert and someone that researches the data every day, regardless of what one's rights might be or what the law is, the data shows that guns do not protect us, that the more
Absolutely.
guns that we have in our homes, the more guns we have in public, the less likely we are to be safe and the more likely that there will be violence. But a lot of Americans, New Yorkers and otherwise, believe that having a gun on them will protect them. And when they're afraid and they have access to one, they will purchase it or they will take one. And so, yes, there might be a distinction made between someone who goes into a brick and mortar shop to buy a gun and goes through a background check and someone who buys one on the street. But the intent of use is frequently the same, that they want to have a weapon on them to protect them. And I know that there are a lot of students who've been bringing weapons to school too. And when they've been interviewed, it's not that they intend to bring a gun to school in our city system to commit a crime. It's that they are afraid. They're afraid of other people in their community. They're afraid of outsiders, and they're afraid because the world is really upsetting right now. And when we're watching, I think this is an important point to be made. Across the board, we're watching television about what's going on in the world and this war overseas, and we see civilians arming themselves as well for protection, and that sinks in to public perception about what a gun will do for them. So I think it's important to remember that as we talk about many different communities and how they're being impacted, that's a shared concern. So I do have more questions for you, District Attorney Gonzalez, but I wanted to turn actually to Alice now to talk a little bit about what solutions that we're working on to provide support to victims and survivors of gun violence, which I know the DA's office also does some work on, but we have been working on important legislation and a campaign with Common Justice to ensure that all victims of gun violence have better access to the state's compensation fund. So let's move on to you. I would love to hear, Alice, a little bit more, just talk a little bit more about the Federal Victims of Crimes Act. A lot of people don't know what that is, and how that relates to New York. How do we get these federal funds to New York State, and who handles the dissemination of those of that compensation to victims who are entitled to it?
Absolutely. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for having me. Again, my name is Alice Hamblett. I'm the Senior Policy Manager at Common Justice. Just to give you a little bit of a sense of who we are and where we're coming from, we operate the first alternative to incarceration and victim service program in the United States that focuses on violent felonies in adult courts. So we essentially use restorative justice practices to foster accountability as well as to help survivors heal. And a lot of our policy work is really founded in that direct service work that we do. But to answer your question about victim compensation funds are state administered federal funds that are used to compensate victims and survivors for costs associated with the harm that is done to them. So this could look like paying for medical bills, burial expenses, things of that nature. And this compensation is really essential to helping victims and survivors heal following harm. What you were referencing, Rebecca, the Victims of Crime Act, essentially collects fines and fees associated with federal white-collar crimes and distributes them among states. And then states, in turn, provide these funds directly to victims and survivors of violence. So in New York, the office that does that, or the body that does that, is called the Office of Victim Services, or OVS. And they were actually one of the first independent state agencies for crime victim compensation in the country.
And so when those funds are appropriated to OVS at the state level, what is someone who has suffered a violent act or a qualifying crime supposed to do in order to get access to that money?
Sure. So individuals who have suffered harm and who want to apply for victim compensation have to meet a series of eligibility requirements and file a claim with the Office of Victim Services, OVS, in order to receive funds. And I can just share with you a little bit more about what people use them for. So if you were injured over the course of a crime and perhaps need surgery or to stay in the hospital, they could help pay for medical bills. OVS also helps to replace essential personal property that's lost. So if your phone or your glasses were damaged during the course of a crime, they can help with that. Something that we don't always think about is crime scene cleanup. So it's really important that victims and survivors, particularly those who are harmed in their homes, are given the resources they need to restore their spaces to their original state in order to heal, and OVS will cover that. And then the last thing I'll say is that these victim compensation funds aren't just available to victims themselves, but in unfortunate instances of homicide, family members who are survivors of violence of their family members can use these funds for things like burial expenses.
So that's actually really helpful to kind of hear all the different types of ways that someone can use this money, because I think it goes to the same sort of reasoning behind why it's so important that crimes are solved and that families receive that that remedy, whatever it might be. And also to the discussion that we were just talking about the powerlessness and helplessness that folks feel when they've been traumatized by gun violence. I think I think a lot of people may understand why the money needs to be used specifically to pay a certain bill, but how can paying that bill, how can being able to cover your burial expenses or mental health expenses and healthcare related to that crime, how can that actually disrupt the cycle of violence beyond, the crime that just took place?
Absolutely. I think that's a really, really great question, Rebecca. And I think to answer it, we kind of have to debunk some of these dominant myths about violence and crime. So the first myth is that helping survivors is only a reaction to crime. In reality, because violence is such a cyclical problem, helping survivors is actually an act of prevention that can help our communities stay safe or become safer. So not everyone who has experienced harm causes harm, but we know that most of the people who have caused harm have experienced harm at some point in their lives. So victims and survivors oftentimes commit criminalized acts for survival or acts of harm in response to the violence they've experienced. And violence really begets violence. It's important that we understand that. The second myth that I want to bust is that people are inherently violent, right? The reality is that violence is created by external factors. And that's why we see that violence is more prevalent in communities where residents face financial stress and instability and are under-resourced and underserved, particularly in Black and Brown and impoverished communities. So if we don't provide financial relief to victims and survivors, we're essentially leaving these communities vulnerable to further violence. And I'll just end by saying that financial relief, we understand it to be very crucial to healing, and we understand that healing is crucial to disrupting cycles of violence. So in that, victim compensation can be understood as a form of violence interruption.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it was something that I was going to touch on also when the DA was speaking about how community violence intervention workers often partner with hospitals, in part because sometimes another crime will happen immediately after a violent act because the family or the friends are so upset that their loved one has been injured, and they are so doubtful that there will be any remedy to them that they then go right back out into the street and commit an act of retaliation. And so the more that we can do to provide support intervening at that point, whether it's immediate intervention through credible messengers or subsequent intervention through compensation to ensure that those folks can piece their lives back together. I absolutely am on the same page that that's an act of prevention. I see the other panelists, regardless of the type of work that they do, all nodding as well, that this is really a part of disrupting the cycle of violence. So last, if you could talk briefly about the legislation that we're all working on and why this change to the law, because we already have a law in the books that allows victims access to compensation and have a process in place. What needs to change as a part of that process to ensure that there's fair access to these funds?
Absolutely. I'm really excited to talk about this. So despite the fact that we know that victim compensation has the power to help survivors heal, it has the power to disrupt cycles of violence, we also know that a lot of New Yorkers are facing barriers when they try to access these funds, many of which are founded in really onerous eligibility requirements to receive compensation. So one of the biggest requirements and one of the biggest barriers is that in New York State, victims and survivors have to report their harm to law enforcement in order to be eligible to receive compensation funds. And this barrier really disparately impacts Black and Brown communities who distrust law enforcement largely due to deep-seated histories of racial profiling, police violence against communities of color, and impunity. So what the first bill of the Fair Access to Victim Compensation campaign does is that it removes this law enforcement reporting requirement that's really the threshold requirement in New York to receiving victim compensation. And it gives victims and survivors other options, alternative forms of evidence that they can provide to the Office of Victim Services to demonstrate that crimes have occurred against them and to then receive funds. in its essence, this is a social equity bill, right? It's really focused on ensuring that there are no priority victims, that victims and survivors' level of comfort with law enforcement doesn't determine whether or not they get access to healing funds. And it really, really will affect, if passed, marginalized populations in a positive way.
That is actually a really great way of explaining it. And I think what's important for our audience to understand is that, number one, Black men are disproportionately impacted the most by gun violence, and also the population to least that is least likely to actually tap into the victim compensation fund. And I think that disparity is a really important one to note in terms of why this is so important. And then also, I think that it would be helpful for people to understand that it doesn't prevent someone from still reporting to law enforcement. So if a victim does feel comfortable reporting the crime and a police report is written up, that still will constitute qualifying evidence to tap into those funds. So it really just provides additional alternatives. Maybe you could just list one or two of the alternatives that we're proposing as an avenue, and then I'm going to shift to talking a little bit to Professor Chavis.
Sure, and I'm glad that you said that, Rebecca. I think something that you pointed out that's important is that young Black men in particular are invisibilized as survivors, but they're most disproportionately impacted by violence, and particularly by gun violence. And then the reality of victim compensation right now is that the majority of people who receive it are middle-aged white women who, are comfortable and confident reporting their harm to law enforcement. In terms of alternative forms of evidence, and again, I'm glad you said that, that we're not taking away the option to report to the police, we're simply adding to that list of options, right? Some alternative forms would be silver witness attestation, an order of protection, statements from medical providers or statements from victim service providers, all which could be used by victims and survivors to demonstrate to OVS that a crime has occurred.
Really, really helpful, Alice. And if you want to drop into the chat or share more materials about ways that people can engage in that campaign with us, I think that would be really helpful. So thank you so much for this presentation. So Professor Chavis, I'm so glad that you're here with us from Wake Forest School of Law. And, I'm especially grateful to have you on this panel because you have such a wealth of experience in a lot of different areas. I know that you yourself are a former prosecutor. You also worked in the private sector as a criminal defense attorney. And now you're a law professor teaching criminal law and criminal justice reform. So I would love to just first hear a little bit about your own professional journey and kind of with areas of law that in theory could seem to others as conflicted. How did you end up where you are now?
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And this is such an incredibly important discussion. I would have a very long discussion about how I ended up here, to some of the audience, perhaps there's some law students there. It's very not linear necessarily. And I actually thought that I was in high school when I saw Rodney King dragged out of his car and beaten. And it was, again, right, in high school where we saw the officers acquitted for that. So I thought that I would go to law school, and I thought I would be a prosecutor, but I thought that I would be prosecuting police officers and folks who violated the civil rights of others. So I have not done that yet, but I did spend some time at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C., which if you know about the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C., that office, in addition to the federal crimes, also acts as essentially a state DA's office would, and prosecutes a lot of the local crimes. And what I learned in my experience there, what I saw, first of all, is an incredible, just a very deep sense of the racial disparities that exist in our criminal justice system. Many of the defendants in my file cabinet, because that was in the days of paper files, my file cabinet were black and brown. Could probably count the number of white defendants that I had. And many of these were for low level. Again, this is when I was in the Superior Court Division. Many of these were very low-level drug offenses. And so to me, it was almost like taking teaspoons out of the ocean. And there were huge collateral consequences, as we know, for the people who were prosecuted and who had that. And so I also think that as a relatively young or inexperienced prosecutor at that time, that as DA Gonzalez said, this was an incredibly weighty experience. This is whether it's for a low level drug offense or for a violent crime, you still as a prosecutor have a great deal of power on the trajectory of that person's life. And if it's not a victimless crime, if there's a victim involved, you again could have a huge impact on their lives, right? And so and I think that as younger or inexperienced prosecutors, that wasn't necessarily something that was inculcated from the beginning. It was, there wasn't something that we necessarily train. You can't train for something like that. So when I left the U.S. Attorney's Office, I thought, well, I'm not. I couldn't speak up. I didn't necessarily feel that I could speak up, and it wasn't necessarily appropriate for me to always speak up, but I wanted to, in terms of the course, I actually teach a course on prosecutorial police and prosecutorial accountability. And it's really when you have the time to sit back and think about that power, what does it mean to do justice, right? It's the government, there's a creed almost, and it comes from a case, but it's the government's job to strike hard blows, but not foul blows, right? So we have there was a huge amount of responsibility as well as again, once you see this kind of up close, you're forever changed. And so I did decide, I think it's really important in working with the students that and we talk through these ethical dilemmas, and we're watching what we again folks have called progressive prosecutors, right? And we're watching that it's not necessarily in terms of doing justice, it doesn't necessarily mean it's not about your conviction rate. It's not about how many people you put away, but it is really about this. What does it mean to do justice? And you can do that in a compassionate manner. And I think I also learned through that experience that we're not going to arrest or prosecute ourselves out of violent crime.
That's right. And, I appreciate that perspective, especially as we sort of talk about a more comprehensive look at ways that we can be addressing this from many different angles. And, I will say as the executive director of New Yorkers Against Gun Violence that while I understand, for example, that policing may be a component of a comprehensive plan, some of the proposals and plans that we have seen are not really explained with any specificity, or we're just talking about funding, increasing funding, decreasing funding, but we're not really talking with any explicit clarity about what role the police will actually have in keeping our communities safe going forward, and concrete examples of ways that police can be supportive to communities and also be accountable to communities. And I know that you write and teach a lot about police accountability and police reform. And so as we're sort of moving into this new discourse around public safety and people are kind of re-entering the discussion around policing, like what do you think is the next step here? And I would say, what are your top 3 recommendations in terms of what role law enforcement should really have, if any, in this plan?
Right. Well, we're at a really critical time, right? So we have on one hand, and it's almost pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, right? We've had this sweeping reform, thinking about with what happened with George Floyd, and of course, for many of us, I began this conversation with Rodney King. And if we were talking to my mother, she would have another name to think about, and we can go on and on. So the problem between communities and police has been something that has been, the tension that's been there has existed, of course, for decades. But to your question about the role of law enforcement, and I will say that I do think police officers, law enforcement, they do have a role in reducing gun violence. And I say that because we're at this critical point where some people may say, no, let's defund, or let's abolish, or those are conversations that are taking place. And as an academic, I think we should always have conversations, and that's what conversations and study and research, and that's what moves us forward. But we're also living in a time, we have reality. So we have to have a parallel approach to this. In the meantime, those ideas are fine, but in the meantime, there are communities that are experiencing levels of violence, and they need some form of protection that right now is not going to come from anywhere else, other than if we have a vigilante situation like Kyle Rittenhouse, which I think many of us would say no, that we don't want that. And so it's going to need to be law enforcement. And so and when we think about the different recommendations, I would say that the first thing that we actually have to do is we can have public safety and we can have police reform. The two conversations are not mutually exclusive, and we have to stop talking about them as if they're in this dichotomous manner. We have to realize that we can have both conversations at the same time. The criminal law acts as a deterrent, and so when I think about should police officers or law enforcement be involved, they should, because if we want to deter people from committing crimes, that is one of the underpinnings of our criminal justice system, is that other people can look and say, well, if I do this, then this will happen to me. The problem in our system is that justice hasn't been equally given out, right? It has not been equally or equitably enforced. So we have to be concerned about equity and those types of things. But as far as recommendations, I think that police officers, often, I think DA Gonzalez made a reference to this, police officers often know who in a community, which groups of people are responsible for violence, for the most violence. It's not necessarily a secret to them. And there are lots of ways in which this information comes about, but we should not be looking at every person in a community as a criminal. So indiscriminate stops and frisks of everyone who's living in a community is only going to destroy any trust or legitimacy that the community has. And so my recommendation, and I don't think I have top three, but I think my recommendation would be to really focus on the groups of folks who are that we know through our intelligence gathering and prior contacts with law enforcement are responsible for that violence. The community is not necessarily going to, but in order to get that information, we're going to have to be able to cooperate with the community. And when you have practices that engender distrust, that's not going to happen. So I would say targeted enforcement, it would be and also dealing with suppliers and dealers of guns, rather than someone who may be holding a weapon for someone else or something like that.
Well, I think that is a really important distinction, because I think that there's so much overgeneralization in terms of who is selling guns and how many guns are being sold and who the highest drivers of crime are, and how individuals who may be carrying a gun for another individual or have, 3 weapons in the back of their car versus, 100 in the back of a truck coming up the iron pipeline, that there needs to be distinctions made between those. But I also think that, conceptually what you're describing in terms of law enforcement and community working together in order to engender that trust, I think that sounds like a good idea. The question is it really practical given everything that communities have lived through and the historical use of police to oppress communities? Can we really engender that kind of trust? And I do want to just pause with you, and this is why I'm glad the DA stuck around, because I know that in Brooklyn, there have been some collaborations. And, again, people are talking very high level leaders and lawmakers about, now we're going to bring in more police and we're going to bring in more community violence intervention workers, and everybody's going to work together collaboratively. And it's going to be a great utopia of safety. And I hate to sound so skeptical, but I am, because I know that CVI groups and the work that they do is so grounded in trust within the community. And so how do you continue to maintain that credibility with community members if you are perceived or in actuality working with the police regularly, right? And the police are perceived as being a threat or are a threat. So I know that there have been a few models that have been used in Brooklyn in particular. I know about like the Brownsville Safety Alliance initiative, for example. I think it would be really helpful for this group to hear about those and how those concrete examples may have been effective. You're on mute.
So one of the things that we've tried to do in Brooklyn is to help use the power that we have as the district attorney's office and Mike as the elected leader of this office, and working with communities and creating a path for public-led safety initiatives, right? So, we acknowledge in this office that we think a lot of gun violence is a public health issue, and we work with hospital intervention programs to prevent additional violence. We're clearly working with our violence interrupters and other community-based organizations. I'll be real clear. There is definitely a role for the police and prosecutors in this obligation of reducing gun violence, but we know that we can't do it by ourselves. And so the real opportunity here is about allowing the community to lead in this space for a while, letting people who are trusted in their communities have more of a say, and resourcing up the community, getting the things that really lead to public safety. New York City is a good microcosm of probably what's happening. There are parts of the city and there are parts of Brooklyn that have very few instances of gun violence. There's some communities in Brooklyn that don't get shootings, maybe one shooting every 2 or 3 years at most. And what those things have in common is that they're well-resourced communities that deal with health and wellness and stability. And so allowing some of that to grow in Brooklyn and resourcing it. So you mentioned the Brownsville Safety Alliance. That's something that my office spearheaded and worked with the police department to say, we're going to give our community-based organizations, nonviolence interrupters, the opportunity to respond to things that don't require a police response necessarily. Give them the opportunity to resolve conflicts and to respond to issues in the community and to lead as opposed to only calling 911. And we've had tremendous success. We had, there was a story in the paper that we had 5 days where the police took a step back and allowed these community organizers and stakeholders in the neighborhood to deal with much of the issues. Now, the police were still there in case something needed a police response. But when we trusted our community to handle situations, they were capable of doing a lot of that work. And that was a model. Another model that we're piloting in Bedford-Stuyvesant is a restorative justice program. We call it Project Restoration. It's a tremendous investment of money, over $2.5 million, to take some of the most identifiable gang members who have done acts of violence, who are not in jail and are likely to reoffend again, and put them in a life skills program and do a restorative justice program with the goal of restoring them in their own communities, addressing the harm that they've caused people who live near them, and holding them accountable, putting them on the right path, but ultimately bringing these two warring groups of people who are responsible for so many shootings in that neighborhood and ending the beef with the restorative justice circle. And there's mentorship and life skills. And so they're going to be different models to get to this. But I think what's central to this, Rebecca, is what you're saying, is that we're trusting our community to play a role in creating positive social networks. And that, to me, quite honestly, is the neighborhoods who are well-resourced. People often have other ways of dealing with problems other than calling 911. We want to make sure that all communities are resourced the same way. And as we grow this out, it's important for people who have, sort of the ability that I have to convene and talk about this issue, saying we need to build the resources in communities that are dealing with gun violence. So youth programming and childhood programs, and making sure that young people have other things to do other than sort of gang affiliations. There's so much that we can do to prevent the gun violence from starting in the first place. And that's really the power of the community to keep us safe, right? The power is by they have more of an opportunity to prevent it. By the time my office is involved or the police are involved, there's already been victimization and there's already been hurt and trauma. So the key here is to provide resources in these communities so that that victimization doesn't happen in the first place. But these initiatives are also key because, there has not been a lot of advancement in sort of criminal justice thinking. And so having these model programs to study and have academic, review over and to see whether or not they're successful will go a long way in helping us to keep safe, right? The idea that you have programming that's different means a lot. And of course, the work that New Yorkers Against Gun Violence do, right? I am a big believer that the work that your organization does about, common sense, gun restrictions and legislation and holding our legislature accountable. And now, talking about the things that we can do to make sure that, gun ownership is done responsibly. And these are all interconnected. I mean, these are all interconnected strategies. And so there is not one strategy, but we have to say that simply a law enforcement response by itself is not going to drive down gun violence, really. And I say this because I've looked at the 5 most difficult precincts in Brooklyn in terms of where we see the most gun violence. And although we've made a lot of success in reducing gun violence, they're the same 5 precincts that they were 30 years ago, 35 years ago, because the other things that needed to happen in those communities didn't happen.
Well, I think that is exactly the right point that I wanted to kind of circle back to, which is COVID-19 has kind of proven that though we were able to reduce gun violence with more investment and more community violence intervention strategic programs and better policing, that as soon as the system was rocked again and those same communities lost the little bit of fragile resources that had been put into place, gun violence went up again. And so what does that say in terms of what we're not doing from a prevention and investment perspective? And, people sometimes have difficulty talking about that because it seems attenuated from public safety, like investing in housing, investing in our schools, investing in healthcare in a way that's actually accessible and credible to the communities that are most impacted, those are public safety solutions. And I do want to kind of reassure our audience that this panel is part of a larger series of conversations. You can't possibly address all of the different solutions in one conversation, but I think that the DA really hit it when he said, you know, when the police come in and prosecutors are coming in, or even victim compensation is needed, it's too late. We're at a point where we have already failed the people who are, are victims of these crimes. And so there needs to be a lot more done on the front end to create safer communities. And I know that this is something that Common Justice frequently says, which is the safest communities are not the communities that have the most police. They're the communities that have the most resources. And the communities that have, you know, the highest level of resources don't need to have police in the streets. And why is that? It's not because of inherent, criminal behavior or inherent violence, as Professor Chavis said. It's because, and Alice said, it's because we, there's more resources in those communities, and that alone creates a certain level of stability that vulnerable, marginalized communities don't have. So I did want to kind of round that out there. Very much appreciate everyone's perspective. Now, Ari, I have not forgotten you, and I'm glad to see that most of the participants have stayed on, because from our perspective, the highest drivers of gun crimes are the gun manufacturers and the gun dealers themselves. And it's not to say that there would not be violence in our society if guns did not exist, but there certainly would not be gun violence. And there certainly would not be as much violence, because gun violence ravages communities in a way that other weapons just simply cannot have the same devastating impact. Now, we have to accept the fact, unfortunately, that there are lots of guns already in the market, and that there is an entire gun industry that has a tremendous amount of power, money, and support on the other side. And so what can we do to provide for more accountability of gun dealers, both within our state and out of state, and really address the gun trafficking problem, both interstate and externally, by finding ways to regulate the gun industry in a more effective way as a solution to reducing gun violence. So Ari, if you could talk a little bit about that, that would be great. And then maybe some of the legislation that we're working on together, explain that to our group as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Rebecca, for having me. So folks may know this, but most guns have that the manufacturers make have serial numbers, and so that is a way it provides intelligence for law enforcement, and it helps hold accountable, dealers. We can trace back from a recovered firearm where that gun came from and gain intelligence around trafficking channels. And it's a really important thing. But when there's a shooting and the gun's not recovered, and there's only cartridge casings at the scene, it's really hard and often impossible to link that shooting to the gun, and then link that back to where it came from and the dealers and potentially the traffickers. What we are excited about, we've been working on for 2 years with New Yorkers Against Gun Violence, is legislation that would require firearms to have a new technology called microstamping that would stamp a code on the every single cartridge casing of a gun. So when you fire the gun, it stamps a unique code that links back to that serial number of the gun. So what that allows folks to do is, respond to the scene of a crime or a shooting, collect just the casing, and immediately be able to, look under a microscope and start that tracing process. And again, I think there's the downstream aspects of it can help in solving cases, and we heard from DA Gonzalez that that is an issue, right? The vast majority of shootings in this country and in New York and New York City go unsolved, right? I think it was 70% of shootings in New York City were unsolved in 2020. So we need tools to help solve those shootings and identify small networks of people who are involved in shootings, to either provide them supports or prosecute. But we also need to hold the dealers and the manufacturers accountable. And so the legislation that we're pushing for is really just kind of a safety technology that's out there that the industry refuses to put in their guns. So all they would have to do is put a small code in the internal on the firing pin, the tip of the firing pin of the gun, and that, I mean, it's very simple, right? And they haven't done it, right? This technology has been around for almost 2 decades. And the industry just refuses to, they say it's going to cost a lot and it's going to be challenging. But just like any other industry, we need to hold, like other industries aren't, the role of the government essentially is to ensure that products are safe. And so sometimes that requires, legislation to incentivize manufacturers and to push manufacturers to adopt safe practices. And obviously this is especially true we feel that is especially true for firearms industry, but yeah, across the board. I mean, the auto industry didn't just adopt seatbelts or airbags, it took legislation. And so we're really excited about this legislation and it being one tool that can help address the crisis of gun violence.
Thank you, Ari. I appreciate that. I think it would be helpful just to give a little bit more context. Have any other states passed microstamping legislation? And, what have been some of the hurdles that other states like California, for example, have experienced in getting this over the finish line?
Yeah, no. So New York would be the legislation that's, proposed in New York would be unique. But California has a microstamping requirement that they passed in 2007. And the industry fought it. They fought it with litigation. They fought it with, and they effectively boycotted it. So just to clear, so the litigation has all been cleared up, and it's, the law is in effect. But what the industry has done is boycott it by looking. So the law in California only required it on new models of guns. So the industry has not introduced a new model of firearm in California for, I think, over 5 years now. So they're selling new guns, they're just selling old models. So we made sure that in the New York version that it is for all new guns after a certain date. Obviously, we're going to have a window for the industry to be able to comply. But we think that that's a much better approach. And the other thing I would say is in the court documents, when it was in California, there was some litigation, they admitted that they can do this. The industry has said that they can microstamp the firing pin of firearms so again, this is feasible. There's technology out there. And New York, I think, can be a leader. And I'm hoping. I think we're hopeful. We're all hopeful that a number of states will follow. And at some point, it's easier for the industry to just incorporate it into all their guns rather than have specific New York microstamp guns and other guns for other states. So I think,
right.
Yeah, I think it's a great opportunity. And I guess I'd say one last thing, like now is the time to do it, right? So we've been waiting for 10, 15 years. And if we wait another 10 to 15 years, that's 10 to 15 years more of non-microstamp guns flooding the market. And so we need to act now, and we'll see the benefits of it down the road. And so, yeah, I mean, we're pretty excited about the legislation in New York.
One last question for you. I mean, what do you say to folks who may say, well, this is only going to have an impact on the gun dealer market in New York State, and really less than 30% of the guns that are legally trafficked and lead to a crime are coming from New York State. Most of them are coming from out-of-state dealers. So why is this still so important to do, with our New York State legislature here?
Yeah, so I think there's 2 reasons. I mean, first off, 30% of the guns do come from crime guns come within the state, right? So 30% is a lot. That's hundreds of shootings, a year in New York City, right? So I think it does. There is obviously a lot of guns that are trafficked along the iron pipeline. I think, it's not going to address that right now, but I think New York has been a leader on a wide range of policies, whether it comes to gun violence prevention or other safety policies. And we are really hopeful that other states will follow. And there has been movement in New Jersey and in Illinois, and actually some tweaks to the California bill to make sure that that actually takes effect, and the industry actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
So,
and I think that is, from a political perspective, it's important in terms of like long-term hope from constituents in New York who are seeing no progress in Washington, even with a Democrat as president, given how stuck we are in Congress. Like, what does that look like in the long term? And the truth is that with any kind of groundbreaking legal action or legislative change, it starts at the local level. And even in New York, it starts at the even more local level. We do things in New York City first, and then we start moving outside beyond the local ordinance level and get more state support. So it is essential that states like New York and states like Massachusetts and California and Connecticut, continue to move forward with progressive legislation like microstamping, so that we can kind of get a groundswell of support from these states to influence more moderate states and show that it's working even in small amount. So thank you, Ari. I appreciate that. We're at 8:15 now, so we've gone over an hour. We do have a couple questions, and I will read one or two of them. And I think that the first one would be well suited either for, really anyone can take it, but for the DA or for Professor Chavis. One of our audience members asked, is there any way that we can essentially surveil with drone technology or otherwise the movements of illegal guns that are infiltrating our neighborhoods? I will follow that up with the question, like, what are the legal barriers to be able to do something like that in terms of surveillance and otherwise, because I know that that's come up in the context of policing as well. Professor, do you want to take that one first? Okay, go ahead.
Sure. I'm happy to take that, because I think a lot about law enforcement and technology, and I actually think that technology has a lot of answers to some of the issues that have been posed, but because, for example, if you have less contact, law enforcement and citizens have less contact with each other, you're going to have less possibility for those situations to turn deadly. However, the flip side of that is that, unfortunately, many Black and Brown communities are over surveilled in so many different ways. And when we think about the legal, it's not a search under the Constitution, so therefore the constitutional rules, those rules don't apply if it's not a search, and it's not a search if you don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy. And the distribution of privacy in many of our urban communities is just different than it is in other places. And a lot of that also rests on economics and class as well. So while I think technology can be a good tool for law enforcement, it can also have some negative, perverse consequences for communities. And my response to that is always, well, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. We can use technology, but we need to have parameters around it. We need the same, as if we're thinking about issues surrounding equity, we need to infuse our policies and our thoughts with that. And a lot of times, a lot of communities. So when I think about the drone surveillance, I get a little taken aback, because I remember the Baltimore aerial surveillance program, where the city of Baltimore was being surveilled and the residents didn't know it. And there had been a partnership between private entity and the police department. And then when that was found out, the community said, well, then there were some, we could go, a different way with this, but we also have to be very transparent when we're using or implementing any new law enforcement tool. So I think that is a interesting possibility. I do worry about some of the constitutional concerns and some of the impacts that it could still have on Black and Brown communities.
I want to give the DA an opportunity to respond to this too, but I kind of also wanted to point out that in general, when it comes to gun tracing or surveilling gun possession, you also run into the issue of profiling, even if you're using surveillance technology, because who's to say that a drone can distinguish between an illegal gun and a legal gun, depending upon who's carrying it. That drone isn't necessarily going to be able to determine whether or not a background check has been run, whether that person is licensed. And so I have concerns about that as well from a racial bias and profiling perspective too. But I want to hand that over to the DA, because I'm sure that you have explored a lot of these different potential alternatives or have been approached with proposals for such technological implementation. So we'll end with you.
Well, I share a lot of Professor Chavis's thoughts on this. In the community, everyone wants safety, but because there's such distrust of law enforcement, added surveillance has been, a difficult conversation. There was, some earlier attempts to put facial recognition technology in some of our housing developments and having a key fob instead of keys, so people would know who was coming in and out of the buildings that were high crime buildings. There was, additional surveillance cameras, and there is something called like directed patrol in other places that have used drones to activate when there's been a shooting, and so to try and the issue of surveillance of communities of color are a weighty issue, and would require not only intense fighting probably through the courts, but really a sense that the community would have to have spirited political discourse with the elected leadership of the city to decide whether or not that's what they want. I know that, for example, after 9/11, there was a tremendous surveillance of Arab and Muslim communities here locally in Brooklyn that was found to be unconstitutional. So there are definitely going to be challenges and a lot of hard feelings caused by that. There are some uses of technology that I think are less damaging. In New York City, we have something called Shot Spotter, which automatically notifies the police when a microphone picks up the sound of gunshots. But there's a lot of work done to make sure that that's not being used as surveillance, and the information, whatever is being recorded on these microphones, only thing that's being turned over are the sound of the shots and not discourse between people. So there's a lot that's happening. I do believe that we have to have a discourse and we have to have conversations. We can't be afraid of the conversations, but people have a right to privacy. It's a fundamental, a constitutional right. And the thought that we could only get safer by asking people to give up some of their privacy rights is something that I reject. That doesn't mean that any advancements in technology can't happen, but it does mean that we do need to be very concerned that people who, as Professor Chavis said, live in Black and Brown communities are not put under different kind of scrutiny and surveillance than people who live in other communities.
I very much appreciate that. I think that in general, looking at all of these issues and all of these approaches with nuance, and leaning in the direction of a presumption of innocence and also of rehabilitation or restorative justice is always going to be where we lean at New Yorkers Against Gun Violence. And as a final note, I'll just anecdotally share that I've worked with We Build the Block, which is an organization that I know has worked with the DA's office on the Brownsville Safety Alliance initiative work too. And I was just talking with one of their members of leadership about some of the successes that they've had. And it really, just even more specifically than you described, District Attorney Gonzalez, they're really putting like the sergeant in charge, the commanding officer, in a position to be able to delegate 911 calls out to community violence intervention workers. And yes, like there might be a situation in which really it's at the point of a shooting, and so the police need to respond. But there are situations in which there's gun possession and still members of the community are the ones that are able to go out, or there's an argument, a domestic violence incident, and it's members of the community that go out. And, without being too specific about, certain incidents that have occurred more recently, if it's a member of a community, whether it's someone familiar or not, that is perhaps knocking on someone's door when there is an altercation of some kind, whether it's physical or verbal, and saying, how can I help? Let's not go there. And there's a familiarity and a comfort. The chances of potential de-escalation can be much higher than someone who's a uniformed police officer that may already be triggering to someone who is already feeling very unsettled and amped up. And so I think that there's a lot to say for a model like that, where the community members are really empowered to be able to help create peace and be a support within their own communities, not just de-escalate a crisis, but to truly provide that support. And I think some of the other panelists had also mentioned like that concept of, in safer, more well-resourced communities, we call our friends, we call our parents, we call our schools, we call a mental health counselor when we're in crisis. And there can be a tendency even in communities that are disproportionately impacted to just dial 911, and it's not always the police that are the most appropriate folks to respond. And so when the police are willing to work with prosecutors to say, you're right, we're not necessarily the person who should be responding to this, and their support from law enforcement to empower communities, I think there's something truly innovative about that. And I look forward to seeing that kind of model be scaled more in Brooklyn and citywide. So again, thank you everyone for coming, for staying beyond the hour, for engaging in this conversation. Please let us know if you have any questions. You can follow up with me directly. I know some folks may have some complaints about tech, but if you made it into the webinar, trust me, you're happier than some of the folks I've been getting emails from who are not happy that they didn't get into the webinar. So I'll be dealing with that afterwards. And so we will follow up with more materials and be sharing them. This event has been recorded, so we will send that out too. So there will be plenty of other opportunities to share and network with this. Thank you again so much to our panelists for being here with us. And I'm looking forward to more collaboration and partnership with you all going forward. Hope you have a good night.
Thank you for the invite.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.